Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. If you're new here, my name is Angelisa, and on this channel we read, discuss, and obsess over books together. And today I'm going to be obsessing with you guys over my top 10 reads for 2024. These were very hard to pick out. I recently did a tier ranking video, and part of me was like, I feel like it would make sense for my top 10 books to be the ones that were in the top tier, and I had 11 books in there, and some of these are from that tier, but some of them are also not from that tier. And I don't know, for me it was just like when I was looking at all the books that I read, I had them all laid out in my room because I planned to do like an in-depth review for each book, and then I changed my mind. I had them all laid out, and I really just kind of like started to pick out books that like it wasn't necessarily based off of their rating or the tier or the vibe, but it just felt like the most memorable and top books for me. So that's what we're going to talk about. I keep looking over here because I have the stack of books right here. I also tried really hard to first rank them in order from like number 1 to 10, and I literally stared at them for like 2 to 3 minutes and couldn't pick number 1. I could pick like 10, 9, 8, 7, but once I got to like number 6, they all kind of blurred for me. So instead I decided I'd talk about them in order of when I read them this year, because I feel like that would also give a good idea of how my reading year went in terms of when did I read my top reads. So we're gonna jump right into it. The first top book I ended up reading in January, actually. I think it was my first book of the year, and it was Heir by Sarah J. Maas. And this is obviously a top book for obvious reasons. I've been loving this series. This is actually the last time I picked up a book from this series. I think it's like I'm super intimidated by it, but I am planning to get back into it this January and hopefully finish it. But I remember loving this book so much, I rated it 5 stars, 6 stars. If you don't know, this is technically the third book in... the third book of the Throne of Glass series. Some people read this after Assassin's Blade, some people read it after Crown of Midnight. It's really dependent on what you want. My personal opinion, read Assassin's Blade before this whole series. But this is the third book, so I don't want to spoil it by saying like what it's about. But let's just say that the main character of this book is sent somewhere and meets somebody really, really important and builds a bond with them. And at the same time, this book was really cool because there was 2 things kind of going on at once. What I love about the Throne of Glass series is that it actually is in multiple POV, like in third person. So you'll get chapters and parts where it'll focus on like what's going on with this character over here. And then in the next chapter, it'll shift to another character, and it's all happening simultaneously, but it's just so cool because everything connects at the end. So it's just a very interesting way of writing, and I really love Sarah J. Maas for kind of changing her writing style for different series. I think it's really cool. But all in all, I really don't want to spoil it. So this is the 4th book that I had picked up in the series, and I rated it 5 stars again. And honestly, when I was looking at like what I would place at number 1, this was definitely a top contender. Next, also in January and also 5 stars, was None of This Is True by Lisa Jewell. So I really, really loved this book. This is one of my favorite Lisa Jewell novels. It's so unlike anything that she has written before. Most of her books are very group of character based or cast like a family kind of, like you're learning about a whole family and you get different POVs from the family members. It's almost always you get male POVs and female POVs. This one, you only got female POVs, and the women were the main characters. So that was a big shift. I also heard that it took her like 6 months to write this, and she kind of just wrote it on a whim, and it ended up being one of her best-selling books and like highest reviewed books. I recommended this to a few people, and they read it and all loved it as well. It's basically about this woman named Alex, who she is a successful podcaster, and she meets this woman named Josie Fair. They both both share the same birthday, so that's kind of how they meet, is on their birthday at a bar. Josie ends up having a story that is so intriguing that Alex decides that she's going to feature it in the series of her podcast, like her next season of her podcast. As she talks to Josie more, like weird things start happening and she starts learning weird things about Josie, and it's just, you kind of, it keeps you like guessing until the very end, like what is true, and that's why it's called like None of This Is True. So yeah, I love this book. This was another like top contender, and it was kind of nice to just kind of have like a mystery thriller in the bunch too. Next top 10 read actually happened in April. So I read Magnolia Parks by Jessa Hastings, and honestly I feel like this is so cliche. This is so like, I would eat this up. Like, I've been rewatching Gossip Girl, and this is just like, yes, like I understand why I love this so much. It is so trashy garbage, but like also like toxic, but also like so good, and it's really giving Gossip Girl. I ended up rating this one 5 stars as well. This was another like top contender because it just, the feelings that I felt, I think that like that's another thing about like rating a book is the feelings that I felt. If I don't feel the feelings, then it's not a top 10. This one specifically is set in London, and you're following Magnolia Parks and BJ Ballantyne, and they're like in this like on again, off again relationship, and it's very like toxic but also passionate. Like there's a lot of passion in their relationship, so that's also why you're like obsessed with them. But then all of the toxicity and like drama is just like, I eat it up so much. Magnolia is like a socialite, and BJ is just like this like charming guy. Like they're both rich. That's another thing. It's just like rich people being garbage to each other, which is awesome. They're kind of navigating how they feel about each other, but also like dealing with the opinions of their friend group because everybody knows like what's been going on. So I just like, this was a roller coaster. I was hooked from the beginning to the end. I loved it so much, and I've been like kind of putting off reading Daisy Hates because it's like, I don't know how to switch to Daisy Hates now. Like I've heard that like you have to read in that order, like you shouldn't like go to like the next Magnolia Parks, like you should read it in the release order. So I'm gonna try and do that, but this was just like, yes. The next one also came in April, at the end of April. Funny Story by Emily Henry. This is obvious. I also rated this one 5 stars. I freaking loved this book. The main characters, like, is this one where he's named Miles? Is this Miles? Daphne and Miles. Miles reminded me so much of my fiance, like his entire vibe. So I fell in love with him so much more. And just like, these two go through such a interesting emotional journey that I was just like, I was obsessed with it. I really was. It was also just like extremely funny, like that Emily Henry kind of way. Like it always, like her books just always are, and I think that's what makes them so good, is that like they're romance, they're funny, they're romantic, they hit you in the feels, and they also just like talk about real life crap that like people can relate to, honestly. So this one was about basically Daphne, who she goes through a really rough breakup, I think with her like fiance, like I think they were engaged, and she is now going to be moving in with this guy who's basically a complete stranger to her. They're complete opposites. Miles is very outgoing, charismatic, and she's kind of more like reserved, but this ends up being like, they kind of turn into like the best of friends and kind of build a relationship, and it's adorable. Like all of the small tiny moments that you get with them, I think are what make this so good. And it dives so deep into like the messy, complicated parts of like love and life and just like trying to make things work. So yeah, like I love this book so much, and this was another like top contender for being number 1. Next in May, I had another 5-star read, and I just like, this is the time of the year when I was having a really good time reading. Like I was loving it. I read Yours Truly by Abby Jimenez, and holy crap, I loved this book. This was one of the most emotional books that I read this year, and I still think about it sometimes. Like I still think about these characters. So this one is about a woman named Dr. Brianna Ortiz, and basically she is dealing with the end of her marriage and also her brother being in like a health crisis and needing I don't remember if it was a new kidney or a new liver, a kidney donor. He needs a kidney donor, and I think he's been sick for like 2 to 3 years. And it was just so sad to watch that as well, or read that. She ends up working with this new doctor named Dr. Jacob Maddox, I don't know. And he starts like sending her letters and it's really cute actually. It's all from like a misunderstanding that happens, and it ends up being this like exchange of letters, an exchange of information actually. And they end up talking about like a lot of deep and like vulnerable topics through these letters. And I think for a while they don't know who the letters are from. So it's so sweet. And the main character also, Jacob, like the mental health rep that he gives for men is amazing in this book. Like that was one of the truly things, like I could relate to him as someone with anxiety, but also just like the representation that he gave for men who experience the same thing, but it just shows differently because we are different. It was like, it meant a lot to me reading it. So yeah, this was just another book that like I just loved, and honestly I will probably end up rereading this book. Like I loved this book so much, and it was another top contender obviously. I think like a few weeks later in May I read Clytemnestra by Costanza Casati. Now this one I rated 5 stars, and again this was like one of my favorite Greek mythology like fantasy books of the year. It followed Clytemnestra. She is an infamous queen in Greek mythology, and basically it goes through her journey from being a young princess to a powerful queen, her getting married off to Agamemnon, and also just like some personal tragedies and just terrible things that happen that shape who she is, and kind of explains why everybody thinks of her as like this evil queen. Everybody always talks about her rage and her just being ruthless and having no mercy, but this gives like a feminist lens to the story and kind of shows where that female rage is coming from and how complex her character is, and honestly just gives a fresh perspective to this myth that's very well known and a very like popular character who honestly I feel like is very much told as a side character. Like a lot of women in Greek mythology are told as side characters to the main story, and I just love these because it reframes her as the main character and her story, and all of these men are just side characters who have literally no idea what they're doing. So I would definitely recommend. The author of this also just came out with a new book, or it's coming out like tomorrow, I don't know, January 14th it's coming out, called Babylonia, and that is about another super powerful queen. So yes, this was another top 10. In June, I read Alone with You in the Ether by Olivie Blake, and I actually ended up annotating this, just like a few spots that just had quotes and things that I just loved. Look how warped the medieval works are, she wanted to say, because there's no perspective. Because once upon a time, men looked at the world, took in all its beauty, and still only saw it flat. Like even that quote alone, like that's just the first one that I highlighted. There's so many wonderful quotes in this. The way that it talks about mental illness while on medication as well was something that if you don't want to know this quote, you can just like skip ahead a few seconds, but it says, the thing about pills Regan wanted to say to the doctor, who had clearly never taken any, was that the ups and downs still happened. They were just different now, contained within brackets of limitation. Some inner lawlessness was still there, screeching for a higher high and clawing for a lower low, but ultimately the pills were loose restraints, a method of numbly shrinking. Like, I've never related so much. Alone with You in the Ether is basically about these two characters, and you kind of get into their minds, and one of them is obsessed with time travel, and then the other one is a bipolar artist, and their paths kind of cross, and they get into all of these very interesting like conversations with each other about life and perception and love and how time works, and all those things. And it was honestly a very poetic, very interesting, very eye-opening read. And although I rated this one 4.5 stars, it was still one of the books of the year that really stood out to me, and for me ended up being a top book for me of the year. Next, another 5-star was Heartless by Elsie Silver. I freaking loved this book. This is the second book to the Chestnut Spring series, where you follow Cade, the single dad, and oh, what's her name? I don't remember, but she's the nanny. She's the nanny and the best friend of the girl in the first book. And it's one of the best romance books I've ever freaking read. Like, I genuinely love this. It's also based in like rural Canada, which is really, really cool to me and just interesting to read. And I believe when I was reading this, I was actually like visiting BC, which is very close to Alberta. So it was just interesting to be reading at the time because it was about like farm life and stuff. And I was literally like a walk away from farm. But yeah, Heartless by Elsie Silver. Right after, I read another Heartless book by Marissa Meyer this time. This one I rated 4.5 stars, but in hindsight, I feel like I should have rated it 5 stars. I loved this book. I don't even care if like so much happened at the end and the like first amounts were a little bit slow. I loved the story and the fantasy and the world building that occurred, and just like the little tidbits that we got from the original Alice in Wonderland. The magic in this was just so much fun because it was from a world that I was already familiar with, which made it feel so much more real and just exciting. I don't know how to explain it. It was just really fun to read. If you don't know, it's basically about the infamous Queen of Hearts. Marissa Meyer wrote like basically a reimagining prequel about the Queen of Hearts and her life. In this, her name is Catherine Pinkerton, and she basically just wants to bake, and she has the dream of opening her own bake shop one day, and then she gets married off to the King of Hearts, and she ends up meeting this court joker named Jessa. And as she finds herself kind of torn between her desire for something that she's not really allowed and her familial obligations to become a queen, she goes through this really weird and crazy adventure and meets all of these cast of characters that we are a little bit familiar with. And it's just, you come to understand where her heartlessness comes from. So yeah, I really loved this book. It was so much fun. I ended up putting it in for our book club at my work, and it got chosen, and a lot of people really enjoyed it. So yeah, I would definitely recommend this, and this was definitely a top 10 read for me. Okay, the last top 10 ended up being my last read of the year, and maybe this is because of how close in proximity it is to when I read it, but it's The Ministry of Time by Kaliane Bradley. So not everybody would agree with this, and I totally get that. I rated this one 4.5 stars. Were there other books that I rated 5 stars that could have been on this list instead of this book? Absolutely. But the reason why this stuck out for me was A, I barely read sci-fi, and I really, really, really enjoyed this. This sci-fi was so much fun. It also gave very much like contemporary literary fiction, as well as a little bit of historical fiction. So it combined 3 genres that I read, but not very much like all together, and I don't read them that often as compared to like romance or fantasy or mystery thrillers. So this was an opportunity for me to read something that I don't read often, and I ended up loving it. And now I'm looking for more science fiction books like this that have a little bit of fantasy, a little bit of like time travel. Like, this was just so freaking cool in my opinion. So this is basically set in London in the near future, where the government has discovered the ability to time travel. It's figured it out, but it hasn't tested it like with humans yet and figured out like what the effects are on humans and like the timeline if they do it. So they decide that the best way to kind of test that would be to take historical figures that have been confirmed dead, that like they know the story of, and kind of extract them from their timeline. They would have died. This would be after they died. And that way it would have no effect on the future by extracting them and taking them out. And they bring them to the 21st or maybe 22nd century. I don't know when this is based because it's the near future. And kind of see how time travel takes its toll and how they assimilate. And they are paired with what are called bridges from that modern century to kind of help them assimilate. And honestly, what's funnier is that the main characters are like completely different. And this is technically a romance book. So you have this man who's basically like an adventurer from 1847. He's from like the Victorian era. He's an explorer. And then you have the bridge, who's from this contemporary society, and they are forced to like spend all this time together and talk to each other. And you know, he has to kind of be told what has happened to the British Empire and different countries and about 2 world wars and all these things. And just, it was so interesting reading about this character, finding that out for the first time, as well as thinking about what it would be like to interact with someone from that century. So I really liked it. It really stood out to me as a book this year, and I do recommend it. Book club at work is reading it for January, so I'm really excited to see what they think about it. But I really loved this book, and it was the Goodreads winner for 2024 for the sci-fi category. So, okay, that is all of the books that I wanted to kind of talk about, my top 10 for 2024. Thank you guys so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Comment down below if you've read any of these books, what your thoughts were, and also like what were your top 10 reads, if it's possible for you to make a list like that. It was so hard for me, but this is what I ended up coming up with. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and hopefully I will see you in the next video. Bye.